Who knows what the qualifications are to be a member of the United States Senate? There are three.
You have to be a U.S. citizen.
30.
I was thinking voting, not
For the Senate, you gotta be 30.
Citizen.
Resident of the state, yes, for how many years? Excuse me, how many years do you need to be a citizen?
15.
You're so close. You're very, who said, actually, you're not quite there, but who said
14.
Who said 9? 9 is the answer for United States Senate. Yeah. So then when you get to U.S. House of Representatives, what's the age?
25.
Okay, 25. What is the residency requirement?
7.
Well, 7 years a citizen. 7 years a citizen and a resident of the state in which you reside. So, for example, former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's returned to acting, he could be elected a member of the Senate if he wanted to. He could be elected a governor, of course, in California. But he couldn't be elected. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's when we get to the president. So I'm getting ahead of myself there. But keep that in mind when we get to the president requirement. But for United States Senate, that's an interesting thing where you have to actually, like, you have to be a citizen, so you have to reside in the country as a citizen. You can't just be here as an immigrant for 9 years. You have to be a citizen for 9 years. So with that in mind, those are the different requirements for the House and the Senate. And then we will come up with a little bit later how a bill becomes a law. And right now I'm just going over the basic concepts, and I'm drawing it out a little more than I probably would with the children. But what I like to do is point out that what the Founding Fathers were going for, what the framers, the writers of the Constitution were going for in providing some of these requirements, was to make sure that you didn't have somebody who was coming from another country and expressly was like a spy and wanted to become a member of the Senate or something within a matter of just a few years. They wanted to make sure that you were a citizen for an extended period of time, and also that you had certain life experiences before you can get to particular posts. That's, I think, the main things to cover about the legislative branch. Then let's get to the executive branch. What is the executive branch? What does it do again?
enforces the laws.
Executes the laws, enforces the law. What does that mean, to execute or enforce the laws?
Same thing as a CEO, basically.
What does that mean?
They run the country.
In what way? Because the
I know,
executive of the
I
House,
can't-
the Senate,
I can't think of the words.
They put the laws into practice?
Yes.
There you go.
Yes,
Thank you.
they carry them out. Make sure that if something is in the law, passed by Congress, signed by the president, as we'll get to, that it is actually followed, that people are obeying it. So the FBI, for example, is part of the executive branch. And if somebody breaks a federal law, there's a chance that the FBI might be the one that will arrest you and get that process started. Then you also have different programs that are in place. So there are certain programs that may help the poor. You may have Social Security, for example, some medical programs. The executive branch carries them out, makes sure that they're actually happening, and goes through the process and is responsible for executing on those programs. Now, who is the top dog, the big dog in the executive branch? President of the United States. And who is the president today? Donald Trump. So the executive branch is the president of the United States executing the laws. There are 3 qualifications to be the president. What are those qualifications?
Natural-born citizen.
Natural-born citizen.
35.
35, and you have to...
Be a
It's
citizen
not
of
a...
the United States for 14 years.
Actually, it's a little different in this case. You're right in the 14 years. If you're a natural-born citizen, then it's not be a citizen for 14 years because you can't be 14 and become president.
You have to live.
Reside.
Reside.
So the one difference between the residency and citizenship requirements, fundamentally, Senate and the House, it is reside in the state and be a citizen of the country for a certain period of time. For the president, it is to reside in the country for 14 years, meaning that, for example, and a natural born citizen, so you have to be born in the country originally. But for example, former President Barack Obama went and lived in Indonesia for a number of years. Conceivably, if he came back, and I don't remember how long he was over in Indonesia and lived outside of the continental United States or outside of our country, but he did for a period of time. Let's say that he was overseas living for a certain amount of time where he really was only in the country for 14 years as a resident. Not necessarily 7 years plus 7 years, but let's say it was 7 years, then he lived 20 years out of the country and then came back for 7 more years. He would qualify because he was here in the United States over that period of time. So it helps to just say, well, when you're talking resident, that means residing, living in the country for 14 years. And it's not consecutive. It's just over the span of your lifetime. And you have to be 35, 5 years older than the Senate, and then, of course, natural born citizen born in the U.S. So that's basics of the executive branch. Then when you get to the judicial branch, what did we say the judicial branch does?
The laws are fair.
Interprets the laws. I like
Interprets the
that.
laws.
Make sure that they're fair under what rubric?
The Constitution and Bill of
Fair
Rights.
under the Constitution, make sure, and the Bill of Rights, exactly, which is part of the Constitution. Making sure that all people are treated equally under the law. Making sure that any law that is passed is not against the Constitution, is not unconstitutional. Now, what is the judicial branch? What's the body that's the top of the federal judicial branch? Supreme Court. How many members of the Supreme Court are there? What are the qualifications to be a member of the United States Supreme Court?
Appointed by the president and approved by, and under advice of the Senate.
That's advice and consent of the Senate. That's the process.
Legal degree.
How about any
You don't have to
qualifications?
have a legal
No.
degree.
You don't have to have a legal degree, that's exactly right. Anything else? Any guesses on qualifications? Probably silent because there are none. There are absolutely no qualifications. So sometimes I might point, I may have had a 5th grader that I've interacted with a couple of times, and I might say, Charlie could be on the Supreme Court if President Trump wanted to nominate him and the United States Senate approved of that. Even though he's 10 years old, there's absolutely no qualifications to be on the Supreme Court or any of the lower courts. And I might say, why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that's the case? Why are there no qualifications? Somebody who hasn't spoken yet. I will do that a lot with the kids. Somebody who hasn't spoken yet, and that's what I'm doing here now. Who hasn't spoken? Who wants to take a guess as to why we have no qualifications for the Supreme Court, knowing that, or for any judicial post, knowing that the Senate nominates, or the President nominates and the Senate approves?
So that the President and the Senate cannot stack the court with discriminatory characters. If it is limited to people with a certain level of education,
Mhm.
at that time it
Ah.
would have barred people of certain incomes and from
I
certain
see.
areas of the country.
So that's not an educational requirement. That's a good point. Although none of the posts has neither the Senate, House, President, or the courts has an educational requirement. Although a lot of people do think you should be a legal degree. So I see your point there. I'm curious about and that's actually